If you're new to our channel, we'd love to have you join our little community. Just hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications. We promise it will be worth your while.
Beth made no reply. She knew how Michael felt and sympathized with him. At the same time, being familiar with Jane's techniques by now, Beth knew that there was truth in the conclusion. He wants out of dresses and petticoats. I think we might give him his wish. Jane went on. I had intended to delay the first trip to town until we could get up to Kingston. I have appointments for you both next week at Carolyn's. Carolyn, of course, referred to Carolyn Beale, who was the co-owner of Marisha Chalet, a posh Kingston beauty salon that was situate in Jane's village of choice for shopping and hairstyling for her wards. In fact, Carolyn and Sandra, the other owner, were both cognizant of Jane's activities, and both knew that the pretty young things that came in for adornment were, in truth, young men. Carolyn was quite enthusiastic about her role in these activities, for it just happened that she was married to one of Jane's former proteges, and she had often told Jane what a gem he was. Carolyn was a true believer in the results of this method Jane employed, and thus was more than willing to go along. Her partner, Sandra, Beth thought, had a streak of disdain for men in her, and relished subjecting boys to the delicate rituals of her craft. Thus, though the motivations were different, Jane had devoted allies at Marisha Chalet. Though the salon catered to the more elegant style for women, it was unisex in clientele. Beth recalled the anxious feeling of sitting in those chairs before the mirrors, with both male and female customers in attendance, trepidatious that either Carolyn or Sandra might find it a lark to let the victim's true identity slip out. That fear, coupled with submitting to the elaborate beauty treatments, visible in the reflection, was a sublime torture. Jane went on as she searched for something in the desk. Michael wants to be out of skirts, Beth back into something less feminine, and I think we will indulge him a little. Did I ever tell you about David? Jane had, in fact, recounted numerous anecdotes about the boys she had taught over the years, but Beth was not certain which tale she had referred to. Jane's question was, of course, only a rhetorical prelude to the new story she would surely narrate. David was here about 3 years ago. He was very rebellious, in much the same way as Michael. He once pulled the same stunt you just saw, so I gave him his wish and let him wear something less frilly. I want you to go up to the attic storage closet and bring down a pair of gray slacks and a tailored white blouse you'll find there. They may not be quite what Michael envisions, but they will suit our purpose. Anyway, that is what he will wear if he wants to. I have to pick up a few things in Hampton, and I think it advisable that you both come along too. Beth nodded acknowledgement. He is in for a big surprise, our intransigent guest. I have the feeling that he will be even more malleable when we return. Our time is limited, Beth, so we have to move more quickly with Michael. Normally, I would prefer to wait until next week, but I cannot afford to have him find out. I lied about possibly releasing him tomorrow, and you must never tell him. I need to gain his trust if this is to be successful. Beth assured Jane she would be discreet, hating the deception she was being made part of, but more interested in her own well-being. Jane finally found what she had been rummaging for and pulled out what looked like a lipstick, an eyeliner pencil, and a compact of eyeshadows. You have never seen these before, Beth. I had no reason to use them with you. They are specially formulated cosmetics. They are far more long-lasting than regular makeup, and even thorough cleansing leaves faint traces of color. Despite all his efforts to scrub this off, there will be a hint remaining. With those darling curls and dainty eyebrows and a nice glow, our macho friend may find he passes better as a girl than as an effeminate boy. Beth shuddered imperceptibly at the diabolical twist that Jane was planning. Cripes, she thought, I'd die if that happened to me. Michael will be devastated if someone notices, so our rebel will remember the day he ventured out as an obvious sissy. I think he will be fairly begging to be back in Petty's after he sees how impossible his situation is. Michael, meanwhile, had stopped his pitiful sobbing and removed the torn dress. He chose a white blouse and played jumper to replace it. He removed the tear-blotched makeup to comply with Jane's command. The curls in his hair still remained fairly neat, and he managed, somewhat ineptly, to coax the few wayward strands back into place. He was basically presentable, and he returned downstairs. Knocking softly at the door of the parlor, he was permitted entry and Jane assessed his outfit without comment. Then she said, "Come over here. You look fairly presentable. Why no makeup, Michael?" Scrutinizing his fair face. I wasn't sure," she interrupted. "Never mind. You look like you've been crying. Come here and I will fix it and make you pretty again." He hated when she said things like this. He was keenly aware of Beth's presence as he submitted to this indignity once again. Jane very carefully drew the fine line of light sable pencil inside the lashes of both the upper and lower lid of each eye, then creamed the pale blue shadow on the lids themselves. She used the lipstick as a rouge, daubing spots of carmine and then blending it into his cheeks with her fingertips. Next came the inevitable application of lipstick to his lips. Jane applied the red wand liberally. "There now," she said, handing him the blotting tissue. "You look adorable. Try to behave." Jane left the room with the announcement she would see them both at dinner. Beth excused herself shortly, leaving Michael alone. He paced the room for a while and, out of sheer boredom and the need to divert his thoughts, hunted for a magazine or something. Unfortunately, this room, like every bloody room in the house, had only outdated copies of Mademoiselle and 17 and other insipid girls' magazines. Their covers announced articles that must keep young girls occupied for hours, trying 10-minute makeovers and the 50 hottest new hairstyles. God, what trash. He picked one up out of tedium and tried to divert his depressing thoughts. But as he turned the pages, all he saw was pages adorned with adolescent girls enjoying the obsessive recreation of clothes and makeup. Outwardly, he resembled them in his present condition, but he felt little kinship or joy in any of it. He read through the magazine, glancing at the illustrated articles of before and after pictures of girls being redone by professionals, then, disgustedly, tossed the magazine away and retreated into the cavern of self-pity. Jane had entered the parlor just as Michael pitched the magazine aside. She smiled inwardly, knowing that his distress continued to bother him. She had thought about the situation and decided that she would not wait until Friday to issue the final ultimatum. She would increase the pressure in the waning hours of this very afternoon, and Michael had given her the means to achieve her end. "You mentioned that wanted to wear something less feminine a while ago, right, Michael? Well, I have decided to let you. How does that sound?" "Fine," he readily agreed. "I'd like that, mind you." She went on, "Our supply of male attire here is quite limited. Your trunk is coming express, and I sent your traveling clothes out to the cleaners. But Beth is looking for something now," she went on. "I have to run some errands in town and I want you to come with me. I suspect you'd like a change of scene. We'll leave right in about half an hour. All right, that will give us time to get back for supper at 7. I have a dear old friend coming for supper, and she will be here by then." He pondered this offer of hers with some skepticism. But the prospect of getting back into male attire was a welcome change, and he readily agreed, thankful that she had offered this alternative. I had Beth find something and put it in your room, so you are free to go and change. Please don't dilly-dally, because we have a lot of errands to do. I will expect you back here in half an hour. He stood to leave, then pause. What about this hair? I mean, well, you know, it is curly. When you have something to say, just say it, don't mince words. She approached him and inspected his locks. They were indeed curly, with glimmering golden highlights. Imagining him dressed as a boy with these curls and the sculpted arch of his brows, she concluded that he would look very fragile. Cherubic, perhaps. I can see to that when you come down. Hurry up, now we'll be late. Mind you, I am simply letting you change because we are going out. I have not yet decided about tomorrow. Now hurry up. Although the prospect of getting away from the house and wearing boys' attire elated him. He bounded up the steps and found the clothes on his bed. They were not quite what he had hoped, but they were more or less more masculine than the clothes he had on. The tailored shirt was made of a soft fabric, and the buttons were, like always, damnably backward. No one would notice the buttons, and he convinced himself that the light fabric would likewise go unobserved. No underwear was provided, but he logically removed the despicable brassiere and cast it into the corner. He kept the panties on and slipped into the shirt. He longed for a broadcloth shirt as he buttoned the blouse. He wondered if he'd been had, then resigned himself to what she had provided. The sleeves seemed a little full at the wrist, but passable. The slacks were soft gray flannel, and the tailoring of both seemed curiously different. He searched through the dresser for some socks, hoping at least the knee-high white ones from yesterday were there, but they had been consigned to the laundry, and he was forced to choose a pair of anklets with lace trim. He surmised that as long as the pants cuffs covered them, they too would pass detection. He slipped his feet into the cordovan loafers. They were a style he had always hated as being a little effete, the kind some fools put pennies in, but they were all he had. Glancing in the mirror, he again saw a problem with the makeup. He creamed and tissued his face, but the remnants lingered. He scrubbed again and still wasn't sure if he'd got it all off. He finally convinced himself that it was his imagination from seeing his painted visage these last 2 days, and that his face was clean, or at least nothing would be noticed. If he rubbed any harder, he would simply further redden the eyes, cheeks, and lip. He searched for the traces of color. They were faint, and he concluded that whatever was there was not that noticeable. His hair was a problem, but Jane had agreed to fix it. As he was rushing to finish, he heard the car horn. He had to get going. Only as he reached the door did he think about his nails, and holding his hands up to the light, saw the shimmer of the polish. He had no time to take it off and didn't even know how to. He would have to keep his hands hidden. He went downstairs. He caught one glance in the full-length mirror and thought he looked so much better than he had. All of this was, to be sure, a rationalization. He was so grateful about the contrast that this appearance made over that of just a few minutes before that he accepted a self-delusion about how he looked. Jane, of course, noted the synthetic appearance, finding him to look quite effeminate. He fussed with his hair, and though she pretended to minimize its curliness, she had, in fact, amplified it. She hustled him out of the house before he could get a good view in the mirror. They got into the BMW, with Beth driving, and went downtown. Beth and Jane were absorbed in conversation about some people he did not know, and Jane occasionally gave the young girl a gentle admonition about her driving. In less than half an hour, they entered a village named Hampton and proceeded to a mid-sized shopping mall. Beth parked the car, and Jane bade him follow them into the mall. It was moderately crowded for a Thursday afternoon. Like every mall he had ever seen, it was comprised of open interiors and side-by-side stores of all types. Their first stop was a 1-hour photo developing outlet, where Jane left some film and was assured it would be done in 60 minutes. From there, they went down the corridor, stopping here and there to look at displays of apparel modeled by expressionless mannequins. Jane was the more animated of the two women, asking Beth's comments here and there about dresses, shoes, and other attire. Michael thought it vaguely odd that Beth, though a girl much like those in the magazines he had looked at that afternoon, was not all that intrigued by any of this, and certainly did not gush over it. Perhaps the magazine girls were the figment of some merchandiser's zeal. Passing through the mall corridor, Michael was vaguely conscious that his eye would from time to time catch another eye staring. When visual contact was made, it was quickly averted, but from the corner of his eye he saw the gaze return. This happened more than once. They were quizzical eyes, and they made him uncomfortable. More than once he had caught someone sizing him up from head to toe. Not that they were hostile, for one woman had smiled amicably, but he was acutely aware that his presence was commanding more attention than he cared for. As if to seek refuge, he followed Jane and Beth into a place called Nicole's. Stretching from the full windows in the front to the very back of the store were racks of all sorts of feminine apparel. There were fewer people in here, and they seemed not to pay much attention. Jane and Beth's meanderings took them finally to the lingerie section, and Michael saw myriads of those odious garments on display. Jane and Beth were making a few selections. He saw Jane glance his way more than once. He distanced himself from the pair, feigning disinterest and boredom and these most intimate garments. He was startled then by the voice of a salesgirl who said, "Are you being helped?" He spun around and felt his face redden as he mumbled that he was simply waiting for someone. The girl's gaze grew more intent, scanning his face and seemingly finding something there that was enigmatic to her. She fixed her eyes on his hair and cocked her head as if she were trying to assess what she saw and draw some conclusion. Painfully conscious of her scrutiny, Michael turned and sped out of the shop to wait for Jane and Beth in the hallway. The shop was teeming with mirrors, and he saw his reflection with a sense of dread. Even 10 yards away, he radiated the look of an effeminate teenage boy. On closer inspection, the countenance was worse. Whatever misconception he had about how he looked before was deflated by what he now saw in the wake of the curious stares. He wished her were 1,000 miles away. Soon Jane and Beth emerged with packages, and after just 2 more stops, where he tried to camouflage his presence from the intruding stares, Jane announced they were about done. The compounding pressure of all this, of being scrutinized and wondering what the minds behind the eyes were seeing and concluding, Michael was relieved to be out of here and back to the safety of the car. It was while he waited for Beth outside Spencer's and Jane was getting the car that the trouble began. He had tried to ignore the stares of the patrons and sales clerks in the stores. Nothing had been said to him, but he was self-conscious that his appearance was provoking the quizzical glances. He felt acutely uncomfortable as he stood there, wishing Jane would hurry. He was aware of the gaggle of boys and girls in the small circle a few yards away. He ignored the stares, glancing furtively at the store entrance and the lot seeking either of the women. He ignored also the derisive giggles and the hope he would be soon out of here. 2 of the oldest boys and 1 of the girls detached themselves from the group and walked over to where he was standing. They eyed him a moment, then one of the boys spoke. "Say there, Tiger, "We've been having a discussion. Are you a boy or a girl?" Michael winced and felt the now all too familiar sense of panic take control of him. He looked furtively at the exit to the store for Beth, then surveyed the parking lot again for Jane's blue sedan. Seeing neither, he cast a quick glance at the questioner. His delay in responding and his elusiveness prompted the next comment. "I think it's a boy, but it is the most sissy boy I have ever seen." "What do you think, Mark?" That the girl spoke now. "What kind of boy wears crepe shirts and, hey, did you see those socks?" Michael remembered that while he was trying to scratch his leg, he had pulled the cuff up enough to allow someone to see the anklets. The girl was pushy and pulled at the leg of the slacks, revealing the dainty edging. He brushed her hand aside, another mistake, for she now saw the gleam of polish on his nails. The boy named Mark picked up the taunting dialogue. "I think he's a boy, but he looks like a sweet thing. Maybe he's a fairy. Shit, he's wearing nail polish." Michael felt real panic now. The distasteful term rankled him, and he was nearly doubling his fists to react when he realized he was outnumbered. "Bet he's wearing cute little panties under all that too," the first boy said, fingering the thin crepe material of Michael's shirt. "Maybe we should kick the shit out of him," the girl again, inspecting his face. "It looks like he wears makeup, and he has pretty little curls. Hey, you guys," she shouted to the others, "come see this cute little thing." Michael prayed this ordeal would end, or that either Beth or Jane would come and extricate him from this. He realized now that all of his earlier justifications about how he looked were self-deception, and that what he presented to these people was what they saw. He recalled the facility with which he had been accepted in far more feminine attire by Hal and Tom earlier that day. Clearly, as he now appeared, he could pass as a girl, but he was preposterous posing as a boy. He felt again like this had been set up, he thought, but in the same thought he longed for being attired in a way that would not have prompted this confrontation. Whether in true boys' clothes or girls, he was about to succumb to some physical act from them when, miraculously, Jane's car drove up and he could dive for the safety of its interior. As they drove away, he could hear the derision of the group ringing in his ear. He felt paralyzed with fear as the adrenaline pumped through him. Jane either ignored what she might have seen or did not see it. Beth was waiting a dozen yards away and climbed in as Jane stopped for her. He sat sullenly and quietly in the back seat, waiting for his pulse to stop racing as they headed back to the farm. Michael was still brooding over the incident as he sat on the veranda 15 minutes later. Jane came out and spoke to him. "Michael, Mrs. White will be here in half an hour. I want you to be polite to her, for she is one of my oldest friends. Edith is quite fond of Beth. We will have cocktails alone, but you and Beth should see to helping Marie." Michael shot a glance at Jane, remembering now that there was to be a guest for dinner. His mind weighed a real dilemma. A strange woman was coming to dinner. The furtive and fleeting glances of this afternoon would become more studied and intense in the closeness of the dining room. The prospect was a nightmare. "Couldn't I just skip dinner, Jane? I'm not very hungry." "Well, of course not. If you're not hungry, you can just take smaller, moist portions. But Edith knows you're staying here, and I will not make excuses for your absence. Dinner is at 7 and I expect you there." What was he to do? He could not afford to be seen as he now was. He felt that chronic sense of paradox again, this time in the context of this very bewildering afternoon. Much as he was mortified by meeting the two gardeners in a frilly dress this afternoon, They had accepted him as they saw him. Contrast that, he thought, with what happened at the mall. Jane had gone back into the house and Michael followed, hoping to plead his case again. He caught his gaze in the hall mirror and carefully examined it, the curls and the delicate arch of the brow, the traces of color that no scrubbing seemed to remove. These were signals of incongruity that were all too easy to be intercepted. He was panicky. What to do? What to do? He followed Jane into the dining room where she was assessing the table setting. Jane, can I please stay in my room? I can't meet your friend like this. Whatever do you mean, Michael? You look fine. You know what I mean. Do you know what happened downtown? Everybody was staring at me. A bunch of kids teased me and made fun of me. I can't go through that again. What are you suggesting? Michael, you certainly weren't mocked by Tom and Hal when they met you. Why, Hal just told me a while ago he thought you were a very pretty girl. The dilemma again. He could pass as a girl in the hated skirts, but not as a boy in this altered attire and appearance. I frankly don't care what you wear to supper tonight. Mind you, tomorrow we'll be back to where we were. But it is of no consequence to me whatever what you do tonight. It was your idea to change into those clothes, not mine. I simply made available what we had. Michael did not know what to do. He knew that there was immediate safety for him to go back to being dressed as a girl, but that loathsome prospect nauseated him. But it was equally certain that he could not carry on as he was now dressed. As he mused, he knew that regardless of what respite these boyish togs offered him now, he would be back in petticoats in the morning. He bowed to the inevitable, before he could say anything more to Jane. She had left the room. After a minute of reflection, he walked into the kitchen and meekly asked Marie if she could help him with something. He went back up to the misery of the bedroom. It was just after 7, and Jane was in the parlor mixing drinks. She handed the icy Manhattan to Edith White and sat down in the overstuffed chair near the fireplace. Jane had known Edith for nearly 15 years. Edith was the widow of Jonathan White, the banker and financier whose family's tenure in this valley went back to colonial days. Edith was a charming, eccentric woman who lived well and lavished almost indecent amounts of money to various organizations and community projects in a veritable eleemosynary crusade. The silver-haired dowager now in her early 60s, Jane Guest saw herself as a model of breeding and refinement. Jane had, after all these years, distilled Edith's passions down to 3. An obsession with the historical traditions of the area, an abiding obsession with fine arts, and a phobia that modern young people were being reduced to crass Philistines by the seduction of cheap rock music and inferior drama on the screen and television. Underpinning this tripod of zealous endeavor was Edith's abiding infatuation with a faded past. A past of beauty and gentility that spanned the halcyon traditions from antebellum through Victorian to the debutante days of her own youth. Edith was a bit of an anachronism, crusading with her time and money to provide young people with opportunities to experience values she deemed eminently preferable to current fads. The woman abhorred the jeans-clad boys and girls she saw daily in Hampton and Kingston and the other townships, and in her longing for these lost qualities, she persisted in funding pageants, theatrical groups, and elaborate cotillions. To all of ventures she persistently appropriated funds and recruited her friends. Though the results were mixed, Jane humored Edith and lent her support. For Jane had occasionally found in them opportunities to further her own aims. Edith was prattling on about her latest activity, a celebration parade and pageant for the upcoming bicentennial of Kingston County. She waxed eloquently over the Manhattan about the last-minute details for the event and complained about details that still needed attention. Her main grievance, it seemed, was the lack of sufficient participants to round out what was to be a panorama commemorating various periods in local history. Jane was smiling and nodding politely at this soliloquy, fitting it in with thoughts that were taking shape in her own mind. The conversation was interrupted by a faint knock at the door, and Beth entered at Jane's response. "Beth, dear girl, how nice to see you again," Edith gushed as Beth came in. "Good evening, Mrs. White. How are you?" "Well, as I was just telling Jane, these galas I get myself into will be the death of me. Anyway, dear, you look lovely tonight as usual." Beth had, over these last months, become accustomed to these effervescent adulations from Edith White. Jane had always insisted that when the woman was a guest here, the choice of clothing was to be both elegant and dainty, a gesture of deference to the elder woman's taste. Of course, Jane knew well, these very beautiful feminine dresses were equally pivotal to the management of her chargers. Beth looked elegant in a rose-colored taffeta dress whose full skirt was buoyed on the crinolines beneath, an appropriate coupling of modern and traditional. Most significantly, Beth's whole look radiated innocent girlishness. Jane was pleased, for the events of tonight played a role in her near-term plans, and she had engineered what she hoped would culminate in Edith's own proposal. She wondered if Michael would present a problem. Beth had told her that Michael had asked Marie for some assistance. Jane hoped this request portended his decision to comply a little more. The Hobson choice he found himself in, trying to resolve the conflict of his appearance amid this coercive dominance in which he found himself. Jane was taking a gamble that after today's events, and her insistence that he be in attendance at dinner, that he would opt for returning to the governance of the women of the house, and act accordingly would provoke the expected response. She glanced at her watch and hoped Marie's skills were both brisk in their execution and fetching in their results. She heard movement on the upstairs landing and excused herself, leaving Beth and Edith in polite conversation. She went to the door and saw Michael mincingly descending the staircase. She was pleased with what she saw. As he descended, looking somewhat dejected and crestfallen, Jane motioned for him to follow her into the study. He entered and closed the door, a woeful expression on his face. Marie had done well in the short time she had had. Michael was once again in the blue midi blouse and taffeta shirt, with white knee socks and patent shoes. Marie had done an exquisite job with the hair, piling the cascading ponytail high at the crown, tied with a shimmering ribbon, and twining the composite of his own hair in the wiglet into pirouettes of tendrils at the neck. A dainty wisp of hair brushed each cheek at the hairline near his ear. Just the right demure touch of color enhanced his angelic face. "Michael, you look darling. But what prompted this? I thought you had decided to wear your boy's clothes to supper." "You know I couldn't do that," he replied, his eyes modestly downcast. "Not after what happened today. Especially not in front of a stranger." "Well, I think that was a wise choice. You make a very pretty girl and not a very convincing boy. At least not these days. Now, I am going to introduce you to an old friend of mine. She is very fond of sweet young girls, and I know you will make a good impression. She does not know you are a boy, you see, and so we must introduce you as something other than Michael. Do you understand me?" "Yes," he reluctantly mumbled, his thoughts straying to the stables earlier in the day. "Well then, On your best behavior, a curtsy, I think, when you meet her. And impeccable manners at table. You look very convincing. If you don't want her to wonder about you, I'd suggest some attention to manners as well. Come along, Michelle. Edith was quite captivated with the new girl and proffered a bevy of the same flattery she had showered on Beth. Michael endured the debasement her words caused him, and he managed to even force a passable smile and convincing, "Thank you." Polite conversation ensued through the meal, though remarks directed, and him and Beth were occasional. Mrs. White dominated the conversation, railing on about some parade. Jane, the older woman, said finally, "I have a wonderful idea. I need some more girls for the pageant. Why not let Beth and Michelle take part? It would be so good for them and would certainly please me." "Well, Edith," Jane replied, "we will have to see. I am sure that Beth will be available, but we are not sure how long Michelle is to be here. Her mother is in Europe, and I have to confer with her and with the people at Michelle's school about her stay. I shall call you this week about it." Michael sensed the implied threat in that statement, and he remembered again the reason he was here. He dared not look up at either Jane or Beth, fearful his concern would show. It was 9:30 when Edith bid them all good night, with more cloying, sweet talk directed at Michael that burned his ears. A sidelong glance at Jane and the imperceptible blaze of her eyes prompted him to manage a dainty curtsy as they said good night to the woman at the foyer entrance.